Breaking news tonight as the American political system appears to lurch into one of the most volatile hypothetical scenarios ever imagined in modern constitutional discourse, because in this dramatized account, a federal judge, described as acting after months of escalating courtroom defiance, takes the extraordinary step of formally alerting Congress that a former president's conduct has crossed from political controversy into what the judge characterizes as a direct threat to the administration of justice, a move that scholars within this fictional narrative describe as unprecedented. Not because Congress has never investigated a former president before, but because the judiciary itself is portrayed as forcing the issue onto a congressional timetable, collapsing the distance between legal enforcement and political accountability in a way that removes delay as a viable survival strategy. And within hours of this imagined referral, the atmosphere in Washington turns electric as lawmakers scramble, security postures harden, and partisan calculations give way to raw constitutional mechanics. Because once a judge places documented findings into the hands of legislators, the question is no longer whether politics will intervene, but whether institutions will hold under the strain. And in this scenario, the referral document itself is depicted as exhaustive and relentless, cataloging alleged violations, warnings ignored, escalating rhetoric, and a pattern of behavior that the judge frames not as isolated lapses, but as deliberate defiance, language chosen carefully to suggest intent rather than accident, repetition rather than impulse, and danger rather than mere disruption. And that framing matters because it reshapes how every subsequent actor is portrayed as responding, from House members weighing impeachment articles to senators calculating trial optics, to security agencies treating online rhetoric not as noise but as operational risk. And the narrative accelerates as lawmakers from competitive districts are shown reassessing their positions in real time, not out of ideological conversion, but out of exhaustion, fear of chaos, and an instinct for institutional self-preservation, while leadership invokes emergency procedures designed for moments when delay itself becomes destabilizing, compressing weeks of debate into days and turning the legislative calendar into a countdown clock that dominates every broadcast, every caucus meeting, every closed-door strategy session. And parallel to this imagined congressional sprint runs a portrayal of a former president spiraling publicly, posting increasingly incendiary messages that in this narrative are treated not as venting but as compounding liability, each statement framed as further evidence of an inability to modulate behavior under legal constraint, reinforcing the central thesis that power without restraint inevitably collides with systems built to impose limits. And as the hours tick down toward a fast-tracked vote, the story widens to include the broader implications, the fear among allies abroad who see instability as weakness, the interest of adversaries who read domestic fracture as opportunity, and the unease among ordinary citizens watching institutions strain under the weight of a personality that refuses to yield, while behind the scenes the machinery of accountability grinds forward. Lawyers debate exposure, aides reassess loyalty, and the once abstract concept of constitutional crisis becomes a lived reality measured in security briefings, emergency rules, and sleepless nights. And throughout this dramatized account, the central argument remains consistent and relentless that no single figure, however powerful, can indefinitely outrun procedure once evidence accumulates and timelines collapse. That delay is a tactic only so long as institutions allow it, and that the moment those institutions synchronize judicial findings feeding legislative action feeding public consequence, momentum becomes irreversible, and by the time the imagined House convenes for its decisive vote, the outcome feels less like a dramatic twist than the closing of a door that has been swinging for months, because inevitability, once established, strips events of surprise and replaces spectacle with gravity. And in that gravity, the script lands on its final warning that the true significance of such a moment would not lie in the fate of any one individual, but in whether the rule of law proves capable of asserting itself under maximum stress, because if it can, the system bends but holds, and if it cannot, the damage outlasts any single presidency, any single vote, any single news cycle, leaving behind a lesson written not in rhetoric but in consequence. And as this imagined crisis deepens, the narrative shifts from the shock of the initial judicial action to the slower, heavier realization spreading through the political class that once the machinery of accountability is fully engaged, it does not respond to intimidation, spectacle, or outrage, because systems designed to endure are indifferent to personality. And in this fictional account, that indifference becomes the most destabilizing force of all for a figure accustomed to bending rules through sheer force of will. As every attempted escalation only tightens the procedural vice, every threat becomes another documented data point, every outburst another reinforcement of the underlying case that restraint has collapsed. And inside Congress, the tone hardens as members stop asking whether action is politically convenient and start asking whether inaction itself would constitute abdication. A shift that in this story marks the true turning point, because once legislators internalize the idea that delay is no longer neutral but dangerous, the debate narrows to mechanics rather than motives, vote counts rather than narratives, security logistics rather than messaging, and the process acquires a momentum that cannot be reversed by late-night statements or rally-stage bravado, while staffers and counsel quietly prepare for subpoenas, sworn testimony, and cascading exposure that extends well beyond the central figure to anyone who participated, enabled, or looked away, and the atmosphere becomes one of containment rather than confrontation, an effort to prevent institutional damage from spreading outward as public anxiety rises, and online ecosystems amplify fear, misinformation, and calls for confrontation, prompting authorities in this fictionalized scenario to prioritize prevention over reaction, drawing lessons from past failures where rhetoric was dismissed as theater until it manifested as action. And at the same time, donors, strategists, and party operatives are depicted recalculating futures that once seemed secure, realizing that proximity to chaos now carries reputational and legal risk rather than influence, prompting a quiet migration away from loyalty towards self-preservation, because when accountability appears inevitable, alignment with the exposed center becomes a liability rather than a shield. And throughout all of this, the central figure is portrayed as increasingly isolated, surrounded by fewer advisors willing to speak candidly, more voices reinforcing grievance rather than strategy, creating a feedback loop where outrage replaces calculation and volume substitutes for control, a dynamic that accelerates collapse rather than halting it. And the script emphasizes that this is not merely a personal unraveling, but a structural lesson that systems can tolerate defiance up to a point, but once evidence, procedure, and political will align, the very tactics used to avoid consequence become the proof that consequence is necessary. And by extending this logic outward, the narrative suggests that the real drama lies not in the headlines or the rhetoric, but in the quiet grinding. Advance of process, votes scheduled, rules invoked, documents logged, security plans finalized, all moving forward regardless of protest or panic, because process does not argue, it advances. And in that advance, it forces a reckoning not just for one figure, but for a political culture that allowed brinkmanship to replace accountability, leaving the audience with a sobering conclusion that the most destabilizing moments in a democracy are not those filled with noise and spectacle, but those where institutions finally decide they have waited long enough and act. From there, the imagined timeline presses forward with a kind of relentless clarity as committees convene not to argue hypotheticals, but to allocate time, staff, and authority, calendars filling with hearings that are no longer symbolic but evidentiary, And the language used behind closed doors shifts decisively from politics to liability, because in this scenario, lawmakers understand that history will not ask how loudly they spoke, but whether they acted when the record was clear, and that awareness alters behavior in subtle but powerful ways, producing fewer speeches and more signatures, fewer leaks and more subpoenas, while public statements grow shorter and more deliberate, reflecting an instinct to align with verifiable facts rather than emotional appeals. And outside Washington, the reaction fragments along familiar lines, yet loses some of its former intensity as fatigue sets in, outrage competing with resignation, because when events unfold through formal channels rather than dramatic ruptures, spectacle gives way to endurance, and endurance favors institutions over individuals. A theme the script returns to repeatedly as it traces how momentum migrates away from personality-driven conflict toward procedural inevitability, with analysts in this narrative noting that the most consequential shifts are happening quietly in legal filings, committee votes, and internal party communications rather than on social media feeds, where volume remains high but influence steadily erodes, and this erosion becomes central to the story's tension as the central figure continues to perform defiance for an audience that no longer controls outcomes, mistaking attention for leverage while decision-making power has already moved elsewhere into rooms governed by rules that do not bend to outrage. And as days pass, the sense of countdown transforms from anxiety into certainty, with each step confirming the previous one, reinforcing the impression that reversal is no longer possible without breaking the system itself, a line that even former allies are unwilling to cross, not out of sudden virtue, but because self-interest now points in the opposite direction, toward distance rather than defense. And the script emphasizes that this is how accountability actually materializes, not as a single dramatic blow, but as a convergence of incentives, fears, and obligations that slowly align until resistance becomes irrational. And in that alignment, the narrative finds its core warning that democratic stability is not preserved by endless tolerance of defiance, but by the willingness, however late, to enforce boundaries. And once that willingness appears, it reshapes behavior across the system, constraining not just the central figure, but everyone watching and learning what happens when escalation fails, leaving the story poised at the edge of formal judgment, not with triumph or celebration, but with a sober recognition that the outcome, whatever it may be, will be defined less by emotion than by the quiet finality of votes cast, records entered, and decisions made that cannot be undone by noise alone. And as that realization settles in, the atmosphere described in this continuation grows heavier rather than louder, marked by an almost bureaucratic gravity where the extraordinary becomes routine simply because the mechanisms of governance are doing what they were designed to do, processing misconduct through layers of review that strip away mythology and leave only conduct and consequence. And in this phase, the narrative underscores how power truly dissipates, not in a single dramatic collapse, but through a steady narrowing of options as allies calculate risk, donors freeze contributions, lawyers retreat behind carefully worded statements, and once open channels fall silent, all while the subject at the center continues to speak as if volume alone can reopen doors that procedure has already closed. And this mismatch between rhetoric and reality becomes the defining tension, because the system no longer reacts to provocation, it absorbs it, files it, and moves on, converting outrage into evidence and defiance into exhibits. And observers within the story note that this is the point where the myth of personal dominance finally breaks against institutional indifference, where the courts do not argue back, Congress does not engage theatrics, and security agencies respond not to claims, but to risk assessments, treating words as operational data rather than political expression. And that shift deprives escalation of its intended effect, producing frustration instead of fear, isolation instead of leverage, a dynamic that accelerates disengagement from those who once believed proximity offered protection. And as that disengagement spreads, the narrative widens to include the cultural consequence. The way public discourse recalibrates when a figure long treated as untouchable is processed like any other defendant, changing expectations not just for one individual, but for future office holders who now see precedent hardening into warning. And this is where the script's tone becomes almost clinical, emphasizing that accountability is rarely satisfying in the cinematic sense, offering no cathartic release, only documentation, rulings, and votes that quietly redefine limits. And yet within that quiet lies its true power, because norms enforced once tend to hold longer than norms endlessly debated, and the story suggests that whatever the immediate political fallout, the longer arc bends toward constraint rather than chaos, not because institutions are perfect, but because they are persistent, and persistence outlasts spectacle, leaving the narrative suspended not on outrage, but on inevitability, with the sense that history, having waited through years of exception, has finally resumed its ordinary pace, slow, procedural, and difficult to interrupt. From there, the continuation deepens the sense that what is unfolding is less a single crisis than a structural reset, a moment when the accumulated weight of rules long treated as optional finally reasserts itself, and the narrative leans into the contrast between the frantic energy of personal resistance and the impersonal steadiness of institutional motion, emphasizing that while individuals tire, systems do not. They operate on calendars, filing deadlines, quorum counts, and statutory requirements that grind forward regardless of emotion. And this grind becomes the quiet antagonist of the story, draining urgency from grand declarations and reducing them to background noise as committees schedule hearings, clerks certify documents, security agencies update threat matrices, and legal teams prepare briefs that assume continuity rather than disruption. And within this environment, even dramatic gestures lose their potency because they fail to alter the sequence. They do not stop the vote. They do not erase the record. They do not undo sworn testimony. And the narrative suggests that this is the point where the meaning of accountability truly becomes visible, not as punishment alone, but as containment, a redefinition of what is possible going forward, as doors that once swung open now require credentials that cannot be improvised, and platforms that once amplified defiance now amplify consequence instead, replaying statements alongside timelines and transcripts until interpretation collapses into fact. And the story highlights how this transformation ripples outward, affecting not only the central figure, but the surrounding ecosystem of operatives, media figures, and political allies who must now decide whether to adapt to the restored boundaries or continue orbiting a shrinking center of gravity. And as some peel away, the narrative marks a subtle but critical shift in tone, from confrontation to resignation, from counterattack to procedural acceptance, as even the most loyal voices begin to speak in the language of mitigation rather than victory, focusing on minimizing exposure instead of overturning outcomes. And this linguistic change signals the deeper truth that the contest is no longer being fought on rhetorical terrain at all. It has moved fully into rooms where words are sworn, recorded, and weighed rather than broadcast. And the script underscores that once a conflict enters that space, time itself becomes an ally of the process rather than the person, because each passing day adds another layer of normalization to what once seemed unthinkable, making the extraordinary ordinary, the unprecedented procedural, and the formerly impossible simply another item on the agenda until resistance is reduced to memory, and the system continues forward, altered but intact, carrying with it a lesson that will linger long after the names involved fade from headlines that power unchecked eventually confront structure, and structure, when it finally engages, rarely loses.